Welcome to Real Talk, where I give real answers to real questions from real worship leaders. If you are a real worship leader with a real question and you want a real answer, head right here to submit your question for a future episode. I have my friend Jimmy Cooper from Hey Worship Leader with me today. I'm actually in his YouTube shed. Is that what this is called?
We call it the studio. Makes it sound cooler.
It's a shed.
It's
a nice shed, but it's a shed.
It is.
Hey, we've got some great questions this week. Jimmy and I are going to talk about it. Any advice for someone interviewing for their first worship leading position? Simple question to start things off. And I actually just came out with a full-length video. I think it's either coming out this Friday or it's already out. Whatever it is, I will link it in the description below. It is like a 30-minute video where I found all of the old interview questions that my church asked me when I was hired at my church, and I went through them and answered them all. So
nice.
I re-interviewed myself. It was kind of fun. So if you're looking for specific questions that people might ask during your first interview, definitely check that out because that covered pretty much anything. But Jimmy, when it comes to... Do you remember when you
I was going to say, these are real questions and real off-the-cuff answers because I haven't really heard this question in advance. So definitely go watch the thorough video. But I do remember, it's been 7.5 years.
Let me ask you, what did you wear when you went?
Probably a black shirt. No, I have no idea what I wore.
Did you wear a tie?
No, I did not.
Okay.
But I knew the church I was at is a more casual church. If I thought they wanted me to wear a tie, then I would have looked for a job somewhere else. I would have worn a tie.
That's actually exactly what I said in the other video. I said, dress for the job you want. If you don't want a job where you have to dress up in a shirt and a tie, don't wear that and they won't hire you.
Yeah. That's good. That's good advice. I think the thing that sticks out the most, that was the most important to me going into it, there were a lot of things to consider and a lot of questions they asked. But what was on my mind going into it when I was actually going in front of the elders? So that was kind of like, I had already made it through the initial interview with the main elder pastor, but I wanted them to know that I wanted to build trust with them and to build trust with the congregation. So I didn't want them thinking that I had this agenda to just come and change everything, but that I really wanted to serve them. And that was my main thing I wanted to get across. And that wasn't a question they asked. That was just kind of like my heart going into the interview.
So I'm here to serve the church. I think that's a good,
Yeah, I wanted them to know that that was my heart because I feel like, this was 7.5 years ago, but I was also older than I had been going into other churches where I felt like, wow, this church really needs some change and you're bringing me in here to do this. And on some level, that was true of this job, but I didn't want them thinking I was looking to them like a project, that's something I needed to change, or like, you guys obviously need improvement in some areas, so you're bringing in the expert. That wasn't the case, and I didn't want them thinking that I thought that was the case.
Yeah, I think that's a good heart attitude as you enter into a church. And it also says, I'm not going to come in here and blow everything up and, try to strip it down to the bare minimum. And then
because I knew that if there were changes that I wanted to make, if I didn't have the trust of the elders, it wasn't going to go anywhere. And so and it may be just the way my personality, the way I'm wired, but I really wanted their back. I wanted them to have my back. And so far, it all worked and God was behind it all. But I think it was wisdom that God was giving me in the moment to be like, hey, you don't need to just go in there and start guns a-blazing, changing things without their support and making sure they're behind you. And that has really helped bring the change, and sometimes difficult change that some of the people in the church, it took longer bringing them along. But as long as I had that support from the elders and the leadership, I felt confident and good about it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I would tell somebody, just as the most general piece of advice, would be, first of all, know what you believe about worship leading, but then second of all, and I'll say it this way first, and then I'll soften the blow as I usually do, but don't lie in your interview.
What?
And by that I mean, sometimes we're tempted man, I really want a worship leading position. And I kind of get the sense from this church that they want me to say this about how I would lead worship. And even though I'm not against that, that's just not how I necessarily lead worship. Or in some cases, maybe it's I don't believe that about worship at all. Don't go along with those presuppositions in the questions. You'll see that in some of the questions that my church asked me whenever they interviewed me. One of the questions I remember was how do we, and it was in quotes, how do we pull people along in worship? Like essentially like how are you planning on getting people to worship in our church? And I don't know what I said back 3 years ago whenever I started there, but like nowadays I would be like, well, I don't believe that it's my job to pull people along in worship, because I'm not a cheerleader trying to encourage people to worship. I point them to the worthiness of God and provide them with the opportunity to respond, and then their worship is on them to decide whether they're going to respond or not through the Holy Spirit working in them. And so it's just like those sorts of things, like if I just go along with that, at some point they're going to be like, well, we hired you to pull along people in worship, and you're not doing that. And then you're like, well, that's not actually what I believed anyways. and then you get in trouble. So
Yeah.
as far as like your worship theology goes, know what you believe as much as you possibly can. There's always room to grow, but then say what you believe in your interview, because the worst thing that you can do is to be stuck at a church where you don't agree with the theological direction of whatever you're doing. And as Jimmy was saying, like, your job is to support the elders and the pastor's vision for the church gathering.
Yeah.
That's your job as the worship leader. You serve under those people. And so they might ask you to provide direction in the worship area, but ultimately you submit to their leadership. And if they're leading in a way that's different than what you believe, then you're going to be stuck whenever you want to do something and they're like, that's not how we do things around here.
And I think it's one of the things that's difficult. I'm imagining people watching this that, I'm older. So by the time I got the job where I'm at now, I had already learned some things. But if this is like one of your first times trying to interview for a job, or you don't have a lot of that stuff solidified, definitely do what Spencer just mentioned about, like, know what you think about like a theology of worship in a church, and say those things. And I think when you're looking for a job at the beginning, like, you want to get paid to do this, you may feel like you have to compromise on some things. And I want to say it is a balance. Like, I would say compromise on things that are not at that top tier level, like the theology behind what you're doing as a worship leader, but style and those things, things that aren't as important, it may be something you just need to suck it up and treat it like a mission field. So I think a lot of times when we go to serve in a ministry, we need to serve it like I'm going on the mission field, which what I mean by that is like, you want the gospel to be heard above anything else. And a lot of times we let our preferences, not even their preferences, even our preferences and song choice, get in the way of them even hearing the gospel. So I think of, like, if I'm going overseas to visit someone and they take off their shoes to go in their house, and I'm like, well, we don't do that in America. You guys need to learn. It's okay to wear your shoes in the house. That would be like majoring on a minor and missing the point altogether to minister and serve those people. So going into a new job, you want to make sure those important things are taken care of, because that's only going to create more of a rub later down the road, or you're going to be stuck or burned out or miserable. But some of the other things you might not need to be as picky about, especially on your first few jobs, because you just need to get the reps in. And I would say just pick a church and serve well, because no church is perfect.
Yeah, you're there to serve the people. I'm thinking, like, when I started at my current church, I was very much like, I only want to do contemporary songs. And at the time when I started, they had a traditional service and they had a contemporary service, and I was only hired for the contemporary service. But over time, during COVID specifically, we transitioned back to one service, and now I had to lead hymns. And I was like, I didn't sign up for this, but that is a secondary, and it's not even really an issue. It's a preference thing. Like, God can be worshipped with hymns, God can be worshipped with contemporary songs. And now I do a lot of hymns at my church by choice.
Yeah.
Not because I prefer them all the time, although I have grown to like them more, but I do it because it's what serves my church best.
One of the worship leaders keeps on pointing out the wrong things that some of the musicians and singers do. This has happened a lot, not to mention in all other ministries as well, not only in music. No one had the courage to speak up to her, but honestly, just as we make mistakes, she does too. How do we approach this person considering her slightly self-righteous character?
Well, as you know, I like to dissect these questions, so there's a couple things that come to mind. first of all, the question is one of our worship leaders keeps on pointing things out. And so my question is, if they're a worship leader, what, and I'm asking you this, Jimmy,
Yeah, okay.
what authority do we have? And when I hear worship leaders, like, yes, I always talk about how we're all worship leaders, we're all leading people in worship, but I think when people say worship leader, sometimes they're talking about the worship team leader. So if you are the worship team leader, what authority do you think you have to point out things that are wrong on the team?
I feel like that's that position's job to do that. So I don't know. We don't know. We just have the question. But if this person is the worship leader or one of the main worship leaders, whether they're on staff or volunteer, if they are assigned to that role, then it sounds like she's doing her job in correcting things. Now, it might be coming from a different area, but we'll get to that in a second. But is that their role? Yes, because if it's not their role, then whose is it?
And I was with Jimmy at his worship rehearsal a couple nights ago now, and afterwards he like walked up to people and were like, "Hey, I noticed in this one song, you could have done this better." And I don't think they were like, "Jimmy's annoying, like he needs to stop telling me that." It's like that's Jimmy's job at his church to listen to the musicians. So my point is, if they're the worship team leader and they're telling you this stuff, then it might be their responsibility, and it's not necessarily the way they're doing it might be annoying, but the fact that
Yeah.
they're doing it might not be the annoying part. And so then my second question would be, from your question, it doesn't sound like you're the worship team leader. And so if you aren't in a position of leadership in your church, then it's probably not your job to address this other person. Like if there's somebody causing trouble in your worship ministry, and you said not only in music but in all other ministries as well, then that becomes a pastoral problem.
Yeah.
And like either your worship team leader, like the actual person leading your worship team, needs to handle it. And so what do? You bring your concern up to the worship leader and say, "Hey, I'm really frustrated about how this person keeps coming to me when they don't have the authority to come to me, and they're not being helpful. They're just being mean about it and saying, you stink at singing. In the second verse of that song, you were really flat the whole time." If that's what they're doing, then you go to the worship team leader and tell them about it and let them handle it. Like there are leadership structures not just in the church, in anywhere. And so we go to the leader who has the authority to deal with the problems in those areas.
Yeah. And that's very correct. I'm sitting here thinking and remembering whether it was worship ministry or sometimes just in the workforce of being around people who have strong personalities that seemingly can't help but correct other people. Even where I was like the supervisor and had someone under me who consistently, in a loving, not a loving way, but in their mind, I don't think they meant any harm by it, but they like couldn't help but keep correcting or trying to make things better or put their opinion out. And so if in this case, it seems like the person asking the question is the worship team member, the other one's a leader, that might just be something frustrating. It might be something that's shaping your character right now and seeing if you can submit to difficult people, which it won't be your last time to have to do that.
So allow me also to correct myself a little bit, because I made it sound like you should just straight away go to the worship leader. But like biblically, if somebody sins against us, then we are supposed to go to them one-on-one. And so I would start one-on-one and just maybe tell that person that like you're frustrated, that like I hear you and I understand that you're trying to help out and help me improve, but I'm not finding it helpful right now. So it's just, I would either prefer you didn't tell me these things, or, like help me overcome the problem so that I can be better if I need to be better. That's what I want. So I just wanted to correct that. Like we do actually go to the person first, but not with like the authority of you must stop this. It's like, hey, this is really frustrating for me right now. Can we work on this together? Because I value your opinion, but I don't need it all the time.
That's right. And that's what I was going to say is go to the people who can make a difference. So with that in mind, avoid going to other people. Now, this is maybe a safe place because neutral, we know nothing about where you are, but avoid going to other people on your team that can't do anything about it, meaning other volunteers who do not have the authority to do anything about it, because all that will do is stir things that don't need to be stirred or build untrust, if that's how you say that. Yeah, so don't do that.
So, if you would like to protect your team from getting people on your team that act like this, one of the ways you do that is by screening them and vetting them before they join the team. And the best way to do that is to have a interview process, an application form that people fill out so that you can get to know them before they actually join the worship team. And so I've got something for you. It's called the Worship Team Toolkit. I'll link it down in the description below. If you are a worship team leader and you don't have that process in place at your church, that's a really important process to have in place. So in the Worship Team Toolkit, I've got my code of conduct that I hand out to my worship team. You can just copy and paste that and implement it in your worship ministry. And I've got my application form as well that people fill out. So you can see how I've structured those things to hopefully protect my team as much as possible from experiencing these kinds of problems. They'll inevitably come up, but we can at least take the step to filter people before they get on the team. So check that out in the description below. Other than that, thanks so much for joining us. Until we see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.